Welcome to the World United. Welcome to the World United.
So we're gonna move on into the panel discussion part of the presentation this evening, or this morning. I keep thinking it's evening and it's morning. But I'd like to also invite some of the other people who may be listening in on the thread also to participate if they'd like. But Flick, I'm going to address you first because I wanted to just touch base with some of the things you were talking about. It's always very impressive to me that people who are able to find themselves in a situation that others would just think are unbearable, unbelievable, sort of livable, can somehow overcome that by just becoming conscious of it, saying, yeah, I know you're there, but you're not going to take over my life. That's so powerful.
Yeah, it's certainly been quite the journey. I wasn't always good at it, I will tell you that much. Certainly, I started out with a lot of my symptoms and physical and mental health conditions when I was only 13. And so it's been, over 20 years really that I've been working through all of these different steps and doing all of the study and trying to kind of work out a system for me to live well. And it really came down, for me, it came down to number one, just sort of being really not having any other option presented to me. Quite literally, I was blamed over and over again for my physical and mental health conditions, which was extremely traumatizing. So medical gaslighting is something that happens sort of on a regular basis to a lot of people with invisible conditions. And that's certainly where all of that started out for me. And at the end of the day, I just sort of thought, well, I'm either going to live this life that's been essentially prescribed for me by the world around me and by the medical professionals. That is, you're not going to be able to work, you're not going to be able to do any of the things that you want to do. It's going to be a low quality of life and you're going to be treated really, really poorly as though you've made this happen to yourself. Or you can get up and you can work this thing through and give yourself the best possible shot that you can of living a quality of life. And I knew that there was a chance that I wouldn't get it right and I wouldn't work it out. But I thought, well, if I die trying, then I die trying. And quite literally, it was that extreme for me. So it's ended up being, as hard as it's been in many ways, it's been the perfect journey because it's really allowed me to understand the human form so much more than I probably ever would have done had I not had those obstacles in front of me and not undertaken all of the study and the path that I have. And I'm actually really grateful for it now because it means I can get out and I can help more. It just means that I can talk to that 13-year-old sitting in a hospital bed that was exactly like I was and say to them, there is a way that you can still love yourself and live the life that you want to live, even with all the stuff that's being thrown at you. So anyone that is dealing with stuff, I'm with you. I get it. I really, really do. But, don't worry about what's going on the outside. Don't worry about comparing yourself to anybody else. Spend time learning to love and treat yourself with kindness and curiosity. And there's a lot that you can do with that.
Sorry, I was going to say, I think the other thing too is people who seem to be successful at being able to do what you're talking about are people who don't buy into the diagnosis. They don't necessarily buy into it,
Yeah, that's true. And I think the thing is, the diagnosis is one thing, but for a lot of people with chronic conditions and things in particular, they will never reach diagnosis. And there's multiple different reasons for that. But one of them is that our healthcare systems across the world are not designed for those that are living with chronic health conditions, and in particular those that are invisible conditions. So really, very often it's having to convince doctors to take you seriously in order to even do any research to find a diagnosis. And the average invisible condition will take up to a decade to diagnose. Most of them are incurable. Many of the treatment options that are available have got serious long-term side effects for your body, for your mental, emotional well-being. It's extraordinarily expensive. And so for a lot of people, even seeking that diagnosis, becomes an obstacle in so many ways. So for me, it really, in the end, it didn't matter what label they put on it, and often how many times they take the label off and stick another one on, and so on and so forth. It's never linear. It became about looking at my human body with that kindness and curiosity and saying, what can I do with the human body that I was born with? Because no one's going to trade it in for a new one. No one's going to give me a different mind. This is up to me really to try and understand myself. And I think the great thing about that is that it's taught me that we are all unique, with or without chronic health conditions. And one of the biggest mistakes that we make globally is trying to carbon copy ourselves, as though what's going to work for one person works for the next, or that I have to do this kind of exercise because my partner or my wife or my husband does this kind of exercise and that works for them. It's never about that. It's about the individual, and it's about that holistic approach and understanding. So I think if we can all just be a little bit more self-care focused, a little bit more curious and kind towards ourselves, then, it doesn't matter what gets thrown your way, you will find ways to navigate and cope with it.
It's interesting that you say that, because in the previous session we were talking about the same thing about self-esteem, self-worth, the way you view your own personal you. How do you see yourself? And I like I said earlier, I teach young people, 18, 19, 20, and the biggest thing that I see is that they have this lack of self-esteem, because and I think it's the system. I think the system has been designed to say, hey, you made a mistake, rather than, hey, 4 out of 5 of the things you did right,
Mm-hmm.
And it's all part of the same thing. At some point in time you say, and I was kind of going to ask you that, at some point in time you must have gotten to a stage where you said, enough is enough. I'm not going to be a victim anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think probably I went in and out of that phase multiple times between the age of probably 13 and say 22 or 23, that I would sort of go through these big arcs of self-exploration and dealing with, self-esteem issues and things like that. I mean, I absolutely, some of the stuff I had experienced probably in the first 2 to 3 years with the medical system did an absolute number on my head. It really, really did. I absolutely believed that I was making it all happen to myself, and that I was a burden, and that I should be ashamed, and that I wasn't worthy, and all of these sorts of things that had been said to me by people in positions of authority when my brain was not yet fully developed. So I had a lot of mental health conditions to work through. I developed OCD and PTSD, anxiety, depression, you name it. I had every acronym. It was a pile of really complicated stuff. My body was not a good place to reside. My mind wasn't a good place to reside. And it really kind of just, they reached a couple of critical points, I think, where there was a part of me that stepped up inside and just said, enough is enough. I'm not going to allow the world to dictate anymore what it is that I'm supposed to be feeling or thinking about myself. And I know there's something good underneath all of this, and it's there, and I just have to keep trying to reach it, regardless of whether anyone else around me thinks it's, worth doing that or not. And that sort of led me to understanding a lot of those things about, self-esteem, that the system has designed us to really believe that there is this success and there's failure, and that there's nothing in between, that everything is linear and flat and black and white. And that's not the case with anything. Everything's curvy, everything has gray, and, you're not failing, you're just still learning. There's just so many ways in which we have tried to create a society that fits into perfect little boxes, and in reality human beings can never be that. We are not perfect little boxes. We all come with our own unique DNA and cultural experience, and we carry the trauma of our families inside ourselves. These things perpetuate on, and each generation does their little bit to try and course correct and change things and tweak things. It's a never-ending moving target, and we are never complete. We are always a work in progress. There is always more to learn and to do. And I think that's one of the bittersweet but beautiful aspects of our human selves, is that we constantly in a process of change and evolution. And learning to go through a grieving process of letting go of our identity of what we think we are in any point in time, and accepting that we are going to change again tomorrow and the day after that and the day after that. That's part of the journey. And it's actually really beautiful when you embrace it and stop fighting against it.
Sure keeps things exciting, doesn't it?
It's certainly not boring. Life is not boring. It's only boring if you let it be boring. I really, really believe that. Yeah, there's so much that you can learn and embrace and do if you are willing to just kind of open yourself up to a whole bunch of stuff and get comfortable with sometimes falling flat on your face, because that's part of the journey too, right?
Right. I mean, it's powerful that someone like you comes forward and says, okay, here's what I dealt with. You know, I don't know if you know Joe Dispenza, if you're familiar with Joe Dispenza, but he talks a lot about some of the same things you're talking about, obviously. And he went through a similar kind of tough physical incident in his came through it. And I think in both cases, you become kind of a beacon in the sense that people who say what I'm going through is tough, but somebody else did it, they can go through it. I remember the first time I did a fire walk. It was like that. It was like, wow, if he can do it, if she can do it, then I can do it. And it opens up this whole, it's like you open this curtain and says, I believed all these things couldn't happen before, and now they can.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's one of the key things that I definitely observed both at the time and certainly, I guess, as my adult self looking back on my, teen experience, was there was no representation at all anywhere for what I was going through, certainly none that was positive. A lot of the conditions that I deal with, so one of my diseases is Crohn's disease. It's an inflammatory bowel disease. And many of the symptoms of that are stigmatized. People don't sit down and talk about having diarrhea all the time and vomiting all the time and, things of that nature. And any references to some of the symptoms I were going through were in, the occasional movie where they would quite literally make that person out to be, neurotic and insane, and that they were making these things happen to themselves. So the world around me was constantly telling me over and over again that I was wrong and I was broken and I was something to be laughed at and ashamed of and all of these kinds of things. And there was nobody who was actually living it that was standing up and saying, actually, this is not what it's like at all. And this is what I've learned from the experience. And let's have some perspective and let's actually be open and talk about the full spectrum of the human experience, because it is messy and glorious and gross and wonderful, and it's all encompassing. Why are we trying to segment it into these perfect little segments of the aim is to only be happy? Well, of course, that's unrealistic. We're never going to only be happy. We're going to sometimes be grief-stricken and in pain and hurting, and we need to talk about those things, because when we see or we hear from somebody that is going through that experience, it empowers us not to become like that person, but to become the best of ourselves, because we turn our eyes back in and say, oh, I recognize that inside myself, and we invest in that, and that brings it to the surface, and that in itself changes not only that person's life, but the people around them. So it has a real follow-on effect, because we are, tribal, communal animals by our very nature. So what we do affects everyone around us, even when we're in isolation, like we have been for basically the past 2 years. So there's just so much positive to come out of it if you're willing to become able to self-advocate for yourself. It really changes the game for you, but it'll change it for other people as well.
Absolutely. I know there's some other people on this thread. If anybody else has any comments you'd like to make, please feel free to jump in and say something. Otherwise, Flick and I are just having a
chinwag. Having a good old chat.
No, I mean, I find it powerful when people get to the point where they stop listening to, number one, or other people tell them how they feel they need to feel. And when they decide, when they realize that they're the master of that, they're the master of how they feel. That's a powerful thing.
It is, and it doesn't mean. I think one of the misconceptions that can sometimes happen, which I think is worth pointing out, is being mindful and being aware of your own self, your physical needs and your emotional responses and things doesn't mean that you're not going to have them. It doesn't eradicate them. It doesn't stop you from feeling angry or frustrated or hurt or pain or any of the other things that we've been drummed into thinking it's shameful or we shouldn't talk about, or it's, you know, it's stigmatized into complete suppression. It simply means that you're able to see those things as part of the journey and you understand how to cope with them and to pull learnings from them, because they're there for a reason. Like, all of these things are there to, you know, be grappled with and to teach us and to guide us. It's our body's way of saying, hey, maybe something is out of alignment or there's something to be learnt here. And so, you know, being mindful is not going to stop you from feeling anything that you don't like feeling. It is, however, going to give it a purpose, and it's going to allow you to move through it with your identity and yourself intact.
Funny how life always finds a way to make you a little more aware. Huh? I just noticed Arthur has kind of popped in. Did you have something you wanted to add, Arthur, or do you have some comments?
Yeah, look, I'm named after two grandfathers. One was Arthur and one was Fred. I'm better known as Fred. Only grandmother knows me better as Fred Kelly, but that's just up there because of how things are done, you know, on Zoom. So, yeah. I want to, Click. Look, I was listening to everything that you were saying, and I don't know if a lot of people know this, but in our part of the country, our society is very much a matriarchal society. I don't know if you know what living in Kempsey is like. The Dunghutti people, we were awarded native title in 1996. First mainland native title claim, successful claim, and that was huge. And whether we wasted our time doing that, you know, once we had that landmark ruling. But it's really hard for a lot of our women in the fact that we have a lot of mummy daddies that need a lot of support. We have a lot of our grandmothers who are actually playing the role of mothers again.
Yeah.
And they have to do this in the situation where they're living in poverty. Because of low school, you know, completion rates and employment in Kempsey is pretty, you know, non-existent for Aboriginal people. There are, keeping in mind that Kempsey and the Macleay Valley, well, actually our electorate, and it's a fact, our electorate was in the top two that voted no in the 1967 referendum. And we know, and when grandmother spoke about racial discrimination and a whole lot of other stuff, we live it. And I think that it's wrong that most of the time our women cop the brunt of it.
Yeah.
And I'd always advocate for people to come to Kempsey and share a lot of the wisdom with our women. I enjoy speaking with Marianne, certainly. So if it was possible at all, I'd love to invite you to work with Marianne and to maybe do some virtual workshops and speak to some of our women about that strength. And there are enough men in this town that would support that.
Amazing.
Because we do support our women. I've got 5 sisters. I've got a beautiful wife and 5 sisters, and I support them massively.
Amazing.
Yes, it was. But thank you. Look, I'm very interested in some of the stuff you were saying, really. And all of the lessons today have been fantastic. And it's about you transform yourself. And you can't really transform other people until you transform yourself.
Agreed.
And realise the strength within. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Fred. That's wonderful. Listening. Thank you. That's wonderful. And nice to meet you, Fred. Officially nice to see your face and hear your voice as well. And yeah, look, I of course don't have that personal, you know, experience of exactly what you're talking about. I have lived in poverty myself. I do understand what that is like, where you don't know how you're going to find that $2 for the next bottle of milk, and you know, having a chronic health condition means I've certainly lived that reality for long periods of time. But I do very much also understand how many systems in general, especially in society, are set up against women. There's a lot of bias both in health, in government, in a whole bunch of different systems against adequately supporting women who do the bulk of the heavy lifting when it comes to creating the community in which they live in and the well-being of the community as it's perpetuated generation to generation. So it would be my absolute honour to do anything that I can to assist and to give these women that sense of self-empowerment and to help fortify that resilience for them. And of course, to give them the tools that they need to keep filling the cup that they are so generously pouring out of, I'm sure to the point where it's beyond empty. A lot of the time, it's going to be really essential for them to have those tools. So anything I can do to assist, absolutely. I would be absolutely honoured to do that. And thank you for asking. I appreciate it.
Excellent. Thank you.
Well, at this point, I don't know if you've got anything else you'd like to add, Flick. I think we've had a nice discussion. It's been a real pleasure to meet with you. It's been a pleasure to talk about brains and research and just how we can make ourselves, empowered. So
absolutely. Yeah.
Your story,
it's been a pleasure.
Your story is inspiring, I guess is all I want to say.
Oh, thank you very much.